All right, well, we might get going and other people can join as they come in, just because, yeah, I am conscious of keeping to time. So welcome everyone to this session of the Virtual Area Conference, and thanks so much for joining us. For those who don't know me, I'm Kirsten Wright, and I will be chairing this session today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands we're coming from today. I'm on the lands of the Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So this session of AIRI has the theme of occupation and extraction, and we have 3 short papers from Kirsten Thorpe, Tito Muchemwa, and Monica Galassi. So we'll have all the papers about 15 minutes per person, and then we'll open it up for general questions and discussion. I will give the speakers a little warning when they've got a couple minutes left, just so we can stick to time. And this session is being recorded and will be available on the AIRI YouTube channel after we finish today. We'll start with the speakers. So our first speaker is Kirsten Thorpe. She is a PhD candidate at Monash Uni in the Faculty of IT, and she works as a senior researcher at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology, Sydney. Her paper is called Yarning About Indigenous Cultural Safety in Australian Libraries and Archives. So I will pass it over to Kirsten and go for it.
Thanks, Kirsten. Always still very strange when there's 2 Kirstens. How is that looking in terms of my screen there to everyone?
Yep, that looks good. Thank you.
Okay. So, firstly, thank you for joining the session. It's good to be a part of the virtual AIRI for 2021. I want to thank the organisers and also acknowledge my fellow presenters in the panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing your papers in the session. So as Nicola said, I've got sort of 15 minutes to present my contribution, where I'll be looking at the question of yarning or talking about yarning and Indigenous cultural safety in Australian libraries and archives. So it's important that I introduce myself and my background in relation to the research before we get started. As a protocol in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people connect and get to know each other through the question of who's your mob. So sharing your family connections places you in a social web of relationships and helps people to understand where you fit. It's a process that builds relational accountability by mapping out people's connections to kin and to country. It places you in a web of accountability by contextualizing who your family and community obligations sit with. So my family are Worimi people on my mum's side of the family from Port Stephens in New South Wales. I'm a mother, a sister, an aunt, a cousin, a daughter, and a partner. I acknowledge my family within this research and recognise that much of my drive to contribute to Indigenous priorities comes from my family experiences. I'm joining this session from the lands of the Darkinjung people and community members who identify themselves as Guringai. I acknowledge their care for the lands on which I am very fortunate to live and acknowledge elders past and present from this area. On screen is a map of Aboriginal Australia which shows the communities stretching from Sydney with the Eora Nation and Darug and Darawal as neighbours, stretching up through the Central Coast where I'm located onto Awabakal land and to Worimi country, which is around 3 hours north of Sydney. So today I want to share some background on my doctoral research, which I'm in the final stages of writing up for submission in the next few months. I've earlier titled the study Indigenous Archiving and Cultural Safety, and the research examines the role of decolonisation and self-determination in Australian libraries and archives. In extending my earlier acknowledgements, I want to thank my supervisors, Professor Sue McCamish, Dr. Alex Byrne and Dr. Shannon Forkhead for their guidance and for their friendship and support throughout this research project. It's been kind of critical because it's been a pretty hard topic. So what my intention is to do today is to focus on the methods that I've utilised to support the research questions on the study related to Indigenous cultural safety. And within the presentation, I'll discuss the research design that I've utilised to support respectful engagement with Indigenous research and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research topics. So I'll share some of my approaches of utilising yarning as a key method, autoethnography for deep reflection, and share how I've drawn on Archibald's Indigenous storywork principles as a method to present relational research. And finally, I'll wrap up with some reflections on the ethical considerations that I've had to think about and share how the research design has helped to uncover important information on Indigenous cultural safety by building approaches that are grounded in respect, reciprocity, and relationality. So to briefly introduce the doctoral research, firstly, the research investigates the topic of Indigenous cultural safety broadly in Australia. It's situated in the context that libraries and archives are places of tension and distrust, and the recognition that the archives have played an extensive role in supporting the Australian colonial project. Their systems of collecting and documentation have been an apparatus of control in processes of subjugating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their sovereignties across the country. Government reports and inquiries such as the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and the Bringing Them Home report evidence the vital importance of records access for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people nationally. However, while they provided opportunities for archival access and exposure of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories, they failed to disrupt the privilege and biases produced in the archival and information systems, along with their supporting policies and approaches. This doctoral research has considered how current approaches to archiving and managing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander information and records are dangerous and unsafe. So the topic of cultural safety is gaining popularity in Australian libraries and archives, particularly with challenges that exist with cultural competency and recognition of the gaps of support for Indigenous people in the workplace. However, limited research has been undertaken on the topic to understand how cultural safety is conceptualised in relation to Indigenous people's broad requirements for Indigenous archiving, information seeking, and memory keeping. For the purposes of this research, I draw on William's concept of cultural safety as a foundational concept to explore how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can feel safe or unsafe when engaging broadly with the archives in Australia. Williams defines cultural safety as an environment which is safe for people, where there is no assault or challenge or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. It is about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and experience of learning together with dignity and truly listening. This research takes the concept of cultural safety out of an area of rich scholarship in health research, including nursing education and social work, and within Indigenous studies, and considers areas of strengths or gaps with library and archival studies and practice. The primary question that has required examination in the research relates to how libraries and archives could negatively impact Indigenous people's well-being by failing to produce information and archiving systems that best meet their cultural and community needs. Notably, this included recognition of Indigenous people's spiritual and emotional needs and the incorporation of Indigenous cultural values and protocols in archiving. It has also allowed an examination of the potential for information and records to cause harm to those people who work with them and others who access and use them, whether within physical spaces or within systems, policies, or procedures that support library and archive structures. So now to the research design and approach. I sought to design a research project that gave strength and voice to the experiences of Indigenous people in Australia who work and engage with libraries and archives. The research designed directly privileged, participatory and Indigenous-led approaches to research. It has been research that's relied on people sharing their personal stories and information. The research is framed by Indigenous standpoint theory and a recognition that all knowledge in the doctoral research is relational. The research is also guided by Indigenous protocols and values of relationality, respect, and reciprocity. The research centres on hearing people's stories through processes of yarning and considers these stories in holistic ways, connected to people's lived experiences, cultures, histories, and their connections to ancestors and country. It is a research paradigm that rejects the view of knowledge being held by an individual or something that can be gained, and instead allows a view that knowledge is created through relationships. Wilson asserts that Indigenous research paradigm is about gathering, sharing, and building knowledge. And I quote from Wilson, "You are not just gaining information from people, you are sharing your information, you are analysing, and you are building ideas and relationships as well. Research is not just something that's out there, it's something that you're building for yourself and for your community." I utilised Indigenous research methods, including yarning, Indigenous story work, as well as autoethnography to investigate the research questions on Indigenous cultural safety. So the research has utilised yarning as a method to undertake interviews with a range of research participants. Dean has described yarning as a culturally safe method of data collection and a tool for building partnerships in research. Similarly, Bessarab and Nandu have written about the importance of the method in being able to develop relationships and accountability in the research process. They note, yarning in a semi-structured interview is an informal and relaxed discussion through which both the researcher and participant journey together, visiting places and topics of interest relevant to the research study. Yarning is a process that requires the researcher to develop and build a relationship that is accountable to Indigenous people participating in the research. For me, yarning has been a way to build strength around Indigenous voice and participation, particularly in relation to knowledge system, ways of doing, perspectives, and participation in research. Yarning, which was conceived originally as a data collection method, transformed my research approaches. Yarning became a key methodology aligned with Wilson's articulation of relational research. I was situated in a web of relationships through relational accountability in the same way described by Stuart Barlow and colleagues, where they note, yarning is a powerful methodology from the vantage point of a relationship journey, because the process engages the researcher in a web of relationships, which includes research participants, the knowledge and stories themselves, ancestors and country, and histories and futures as they live in the telling and hearing of stories. Overall, yarning has been a tool for me to conduct research in a trusted reciprocal manner while ensuring rigorous and ethical processes. I also utilise autoethnography as a method to gather data on my personal stories related to the research questions. The autoethnography writing and role as an insider researcher has provided me with a rich experience, but it's also been emotionally challenging. Within this, I've spent time writing and reflecting on the big moments that have affected my career, the situations that were either profoundly moving, insightful, challenging, or life-changing. I wrote extensively on the many journeys and conversations that I'd had with community members, colleagues, and friends about issues of cultural safety in the archives. I had not anticipated how challenging it would be for me to unravel and discuss some of the situations that arose in my career because of my proximity as an Aboriginal person to colonial archives and collections. But overall, the ethnography has been an essential tool for me to engage in reflexivity and to draw out issues that have emerged over my professional career, both on an experiential and intellectual level. So finally, the third method I wanted to discuss was the use of Archibald's storywork principles, which ended up becoming a sense-making tool for me in the research process. I found a way to weave my story together with other people's stories in a way that was grounded in respect. As I got to the analysis of my autoethnography, I found Archibald's principles of storywork, which are here on screen, to be incredibly powerful. They helped me weave the data from my own personal story together with the data from the yarning sessions. The storywork methodology assists me tying up the many pieces of my doctoral studies into a narrative that serves both to communicate the research problem, lost my slide there, communicate the research problem, articulate the research questions, and share the stories gathered both through personal reflection, yarning sessions, as well as within the literature. So to conclude, I wanted to sum up with a couple of reflections on ethical Indigenous research practices by mentioning 4 questions that Wilson has formulated to evaluate research methods' appropriateness. So in asking myself these questions, what is my role as a researcher and what are my obligations? For me, I felt that the research design and the methods that I utilized enabled me to navigate my obligations by managing my relationships through mutual responsibility. The second question is, does the method allow me to fulfill my obligations in my role? And my answer was yes. There were some very messy parts, but I feel that I've been able to utilize reflexivity and keeping conversations with research participants about the way in particular that I represent their stories with respect. The third question was, does this method help to build a relationship between myself as a researcher and my research topic? And this has been a hard one, as the research has discussed some really difficult topics. I've had to consider my own emotional and spiritual well-being in the research process and that of my research participants, as the topic can be really quite sensitive and emotional. Again, I've practiced deep reflexivity within the research to analyze the data sources and to synthesize them across the various methods to align with the research methodologies and research aims. And finally, does the research build respectful, or the methods build respectful relationships with other participants in the research? And I feel confident in my answer that if I didn't design my research to respect those values of relationality and accountability, that I would not have received the rich stories and experiences of people that have been shared in the research. I feel so deeply thankful for the time and input that research participants have given me, and I also thank them for their trust in sharing their stories with me. So I look forward to sharing the writing and the research outcomes with you in the future. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kirsten. It's always so great to hear about your work and the way you reflect on both the research and your role in it and how it all works together. As I said, we'll hold questions for now and have more of a discussion at the end. So we'll move now on to Chido. Chido Mchemwa is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Information. And Chido's paper is Settler Colonialism and Archives in Rhodesia, a case study of the delineation report. So Chido, if you want to share your screen and take it away.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button for a second there. All right, thank you everyone for being here. I am joining you today from sunny Zimbabwe. Today I'm going to be presenting on the delineation reports. I used delineation reports as a source in my dissertation, and this paper is, I guess, the first exploration of what it might mean to use these reports as a source. So In 1980, Zimbabwe gained independence from Britain and inherited the National Archives of Zimbabwe. The institution is still set up in a way that perpetuates the same problems of colonialism, a lack of access, gaps in the history of Black people in Zimbabwe, and the privileging of some narratives over others. The colonial legacies within the Zimbabwean archives have primarily been studied through the post-colonial lens. However, this paper, I make an argument for the utility of examining them through settler colonial studies and the utility of examining colonial archival records as settler archival records. I use delineation reports as a case study for the enduring legacies of settler colonialism in Zimbabwe. I'm interested in reading delineation records as settler tools for consolidating power, and I'm interested in what archiving these records does to them. What does it mean to have these as archival records in the post-colonial archive? What histories do they privilege? What histories do they silence? And what does it mean to search for Black histories in delineation reports? Caroline Elkins and Susan Peterson define settler colonialism as, quote, the presence of a settler population intent on making a territory their permanent home while continuing to enjoy metropolitan living standards and political privileges, end quote, creating a dynamic built on a structure of privilege that favors the settlers. The dispossession of land from natives is the main goal of settler colonialism. The archives of settler states solidify and perpetuate the fictions that settlers tell themselves to justify this occupation. The archives follow the same logic of elimination that settler colonialism does. By relying on written records, histories and archives begin with the arrival of the settlers, supporting the myth that the land was empty before it was occupied. In this way, settler archives are used to support the stories that define belonging of settlers and the unbelonging of native peoples. Now, to fully contextualize the delineation reports as archival records, it's important to contextualize the inextricable link between the settler state of Rhodesia and the nature of its archives. In 1935, Southern Rhodesia established the government archives through an act of parliament, which tasked the institution with management of government records and maintenance of publicly accessible archives. But from the very beginnings of the colony, there was a great interest in documenting the pioneer efforts. Publications of series like the Oppenheimer series by the archives showed that not only were the Southern Rhodesians keen to document their history, but they viewed the archive as a venue for solidifying a national identity separate from the British. And they created a truly settler history by documenting a history where the natives are mostly absent, except when the settlers are civilizing them. To put in other words, their history is either entered as the records created by the settler state or as part of the archival collecting efforts directed towards creating a history separate from the empire. The records were collected always with an eye as to how they supported the settler narrative. What are delineation reports? So in Southern Rhodesia, the native commissioners, who would become district commissioners in 1962, were tasked with being the experts in everything native. In many ways, they were the de facto archivists of Black history. Most of the records housed in the Rhodesian archives about the natives were created under the authority of native or district commissioners. The delineation reports were created mainly for administrative purposes, to facilitate the administration of the native reserves that were created by the Land Apportionment Acts. The reports traced genealogies and transfers of power within chieftaincies. And with a focus on governance rather than on the personal, the reports were incomplete histories that created many archival silences. While some of these delineation reports were formed as early as 1904, the bulk were created in the late 1950s and early 1960s as the Rhodesians began to prepare for independence from the British Empire. Once in the archives, the delineation reports are seen as histories as opposed to what they really are, which is subjective records of control. These reports demonstrate how when histories of Black people enter the archives, they were always mediated through the hand of a white man who would write them down either as a government record or as part of a manuscript about the history of Black people. The histories either entered, the records were collected always with an eye, as I said before, to support the settler narrative. To demonstrate how delineation records operated as records of control, I used the case study of my own family history. The set of delineation reports I refer to in this paper are all from the Chibi Tribal Trust Lands and District, as I collected them as part of tracing my family history in the archives. They're a small sample, therefore cannot be representative. However, what they lack in breadth, they make up for in specificity by showing how the history of one family is distorted across multiple districts. They highlight the manner in which delineation fragments family histories. And the following observations about the nature of the delineation reports results from a close reading of this handful of reports. The use of the delineation reports highlights how the archive is seen as authenticating. These reports are given more credence than the traditional oral histories collected from the same communities, despite the fact that delineation reports were compiled from oral records. If anything, they are less reliable than oral records, as they also have the added layer of editorializing from the district commissioners who collected them. Throughout the reports, the district's commissioners cast aspersions of doubt on what they were told. The word reliable is repeatedly used, frequently paired with modulating words such as mostly or somewhat, giving the impression that reliability is a relative term when it comes to the word of the native. Repeatedly, statements such as, quote, the following has not been authenticated by official records, end quote, are made, emphasizing that for the Rhodesians, native stories require authentication via official written records. There is no consistency in the methods used to create delineation reports. While the earliest ones from the turn of the 20th century are more like traditional oral histories, with the district commissioner recording what he is told, by 1965, they're quite different. They're composite reports created by combining the reports from several DCs. While genealogies were still collected in the field, they were authenticated against the previous delineation reports. In Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, Patrick Wolfe argues that settler colonialism is not inherently genocidal, but rather built on a logic of elimination. This elimination may happen through genocide, but other forms of elimination include assimilation, forced dispossession of land, detaching people from their histories, colonial education, and restrictive racial groupings that make it difficult for indigenous populations to grow. Delineation reports follow this logic of elimination by reinforcing the boundaries instituted by the settler state, the boundaries that support the white minority's claim to the majority of the land. While the histories that the district commissioners were collecting preceded colonial occupations, these histories are organized according to chieftainships in tribal trust lands and districts, i.e. the native reserves created by the settler government. These histories are a way of keeping the natives in the demarcated areas to which the settler state has forcibly moved them. The reports give the impression that these areas have an enduring history rather than being relatively new creations under colonialism. So when we read the delineation reports examining how they operate as settler records, the archive can be read as a tool for documenting the fiction of the elimination of the native. Rhodesians may not have eliminated the natives through genocide, but for the most part, they eliminated them from the archive, and their limited entry through the delineation reports was used to support their removal from the land. When I first encountered the delineation reports, I was searching for my family history. I knew that the Land Apportionment Act had resulted in my family moving from the hills of Mangwandi on the edges of the present-day city of Masvingo to the dry, arid areas of Chiwi. I wanted to see it documented in archival records, but the only record I could find is a line in the Zimuto delineation records that says Madziwire settled Chicato's government's interest in him and his family ended, even though 3 more generations of my family would call that hill home until being forcibly removed. The first time I entered the archive, the National Archives, I had a moment of despair at the thought that of all that family history that appeared inaccessible. But now I have read enough to mistrust the alleged authority of the written record. Colonial archives use the written record as the authoritative record, but to continue to privilege it means that some stories will always remain missing. Even when you center and search for Black voices, they will be what Karina Vernon calls the absent voice at the heart of the text. In many ways, my research has become destabilizing the authority of the traditional archive, and by examining how settler colonialism shapes the archive, the fictions that archives are built upon become clear. Recognizing colonial records in Zimbabwe as settler records underlines the lack of neutrality of such records. They privilege the stories of those who took the land. But where do we find the stories of those whose land was stolen? I propose returning to that Chikato hill that earns a single line in the delineation reports. It is a hill my heart recognizes as home, even though I've never lived there. It's also a hill where my great-great-grandfather was buried after refusing to adhere to the government eviction notice. It's a hill with a cave my great-grandmother hid in, even as she bled after she lost an eye during a raid. It's a hill where if you stand at the very top, you can see the boundary fence of the Mangwandi Council Cemetery that stands on my grandmother's sorghum field. It's a hill where if you listen carefully, you can hear the trains pulling into the railway station that was built on my grandmother's rice paddy. And it's a hill where on hot days, if you sit still enough, you can almost see through the heat haze on the horizon, a convoy of horse-drawn carriages filled with sunburnt white men arriving and pulling up a Union Jack, naming the place Fort Victoria after their queen. The hill allows me to fill the archival gap created by a reliance on written records such as delineation reports. It allows me to rewrite the story of the settlers. The hill beckons as its own type of archive, an archive that asks for the expansion of the definition of what constitutes an archive. To find the stories of Black people under the settler state of Rhodesia requires searching for those stories outside the parameters of the white supremacist settler archive and its records. It requires searching for new records. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chido. That was fascinating to hear about. And I think it's so interesting that, yeah, so far, both Kirsten and Chido, the intertwining of, I guess, the personal with the research is such a critical part of what you're doing. So yeah, thank you so much. We will move on to Monica now. So Monica Galassi is a PhD candidate at the University of Technology, Sydney in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science. And she also works as a research associate at the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research. And so her paper is Aboriginal Archives in Italy, a space for reciprocal collaboration. So I'll hand it over to Monica.
Thank you, Kirsten. Just try to share the screen. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for the invite, and and thank you so much to Kirsten and Chido for sharing such a important part of your work and your life. So before starting, I would like as well to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from where I'm speaking from today. I live in Gadigal land in the area we now call the inner west suburbs of Sydney in Australia. I pay my respect to elders past and present and to all the Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and other Indigenous and First Nation people who are here today. This presentation contains one photograph of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people that are deceased. And I would like to give you a little bit of a note on the terminology I use, not really just in this presentation, but in all my PhD research, that it's about archives that are related to the histories and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which are held in Italy and in the Vatican. I use the general term Aboriginal, referring to both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia, And that's because most part of the peoples represented in the archives I work with for my PhD research are unnamed, and stories come from all over Australia. For this reason, I'm not able to refer to a particular Aboriginal nation or language group, as this is the preferred way in Australia. But I acknowledge the richness and the diversity present in this country, and also the marked differences of in the colonial experiences. I also use the term Italy, including the Vatican State and the Republic of San Marino. And when I use the term displaced archives, I refer to any record that has been removed from or its original context and is unknown or whose ownership is disputed, using the definition adopted by Professor James Larry in the book Displaced Archives, which was published in 2017. But also recognizing the long-term scholarly debates about the difficulties in using consistent terminology and categorization when referring to this kind of archives. Hence, I use this term recognizing that nearly all these definitions agree in the fact that the displacement of records is not only geographical, but implies more complex and contested issues of power and ownership. And Chido gave a great overview of this in her presentation. So I am a PhD student at the University of Technology, Sydney, and I work at the Jumbunna Institute. And it's important, I take this opportunity to say I work under the leadership of Wright, where my critical archivist, Kirsten Thorpe, who spoke before me, I would like to acknowledge for a groundbreaking contribute in the archival field, not only in Australia, but overseas as well, and who has deeply impacted my work over the years. And I also would like to acknowledge my PhD supervisors in this journey, Professor Ilaria Vania Carigi, Professor Jason De Santolo, and Dr. Alex Byrne. And starting by positioning myself in this research is fundamental because, as distinguished professor and academic Larissa Berend reminds non-Indigenous researchers like myself, Indigenous approaches to knowledge understand that where you're placed will fundamentally influence the way how you see the world. I was born and grew up in Italy, and my journey started in 2010 when I moved to Gadigal country to work in the field of Aboriginal archives. And this interest for me was sparked thanks to the many Indigenous scholars and activists all around the world who have exposed the vital importance of control and transparency over their historical archives to achieve concrete social justice. However, despite my drive, I became aware that I was trained as a cultural anthropologist and therefore studied colonial and Aboriginal histories within a Western lens. And I'm also a citizen of a country like Italy, which has a colonial past, but hasn't recognized itself as such yet. Italy, in fact, used to have some colonies in the north of Africa. And of course, we all know the worldwide influence of the Catholic Church. As a result, this journey forced me to look in at matters of self-representation and agency as a migrant to Australia and of an uninvited guest in an Aboriginal nation. And this included reflecting on my professional role and on how I can continue to support Aboriginal aspiration within the cultural sector, but aware of my own bias. So the research interest for Italian displaced archives dates back to 2011, when I was started a collaboration with ATSIDA, a UTS library. And my role in this project was to identify Aboriginal Australian collections held in Italy to create a first mapping of these institutions. And some collections which I identified were already well known, while others were buried and not known to the public. And this related in particular for archival collections. Some of them were very hard to locate and access. Most parts were not digitized, and they are expressed in Italian and other languages. They are also scattered all over the place among different institutions. And often the institutions themselves don't have any acknowledgement of what they have, or in the best case scenario, don't have funding or means to digitize them. And of course, these difficulties were related to a different cultural, legal, and historical background between Italy and Australia. But they also implied the tensions which are still embedded in the overall conversation, not only around Indigenous knowledge held in Europe, but more in general around power dynamics deep-seated in these colonial collecting institutions. But despite international interest in repatriation, from museum collections has increased internationally in recent years, what is widely acknowledged in Australia is the archival testimonies of Aboriginal cultures and histories displaced in Europe due to colonialism are still often unknown to the communities they belong to. In that this gap is even more visible when speaking about countries which didn't participate directly in the Australian colonial project and that speak languages other than English. So for the following decade, I've been working on several projects advocated for increasing visibility of Aboriginal voices across the Australian cultural sector. And I realized that the questions that Henrietta Vermeil raised already in 1989 about displacement, disconnection, and dispersal of Indigenous information in archives, unfortunately still resonate today. So over the years, I've been yarning with the people and community members I was working with about this archival record in Italy. I asked them if they knew about these archives and if they would have been interested in knowing more. In general, the responses showed a lot of interest and curiosity over what this overseas archive holds. And likewise, some Italian institution professional I've been talking to showed interest in establishing relationship with communities and for deepening the understanding of their Australian collections. So the concept of the archival multiverse has revealed to me to be an important framework in these reflections. And in particular, I started thinking about how the notion of overcoming the physical and nation state-based thinking of displaced archives of leading scholar Anne Gilliland could have been applied to the Italian archival collection. I also started on reflecting on how to consider for the first time archival records related to Aboriginal Australian held in Italy as a unified example of displayed archive, and how this could have opened up opportunities for establishing provenance among collections and therefore more chances to locate their communities of origin. This journey also challenged my idea of what a colonial archival record is multiple times. Because, for example, I've been asked over the years assistance with birth certificates related to individuals with Italian and Aboriginal descent who still struggle to access their birth certificate, who are held in small Italian archives and which are expressed in Old Italian. So this conversation led me to reflect on the need of opening up a transnational space of dialogue about these archives, but to do so in a way that centers Aboriginal worldviews, voices, and aspirations, and that could support data sovereignty. I started reflecting on how I could have contributed to forge a space where Indigenous ways of knowing and in Italian archival traditions could converge through understanding and translating concepts and needs. I would say a sort of cultural interface, to use the groundbreaking concept of Professor Martin Nakata. But first of all, archival collection in Italy needs to be more visible and accessible in culturally safe way for communities to see what's in there. And I thought that I could have used my standpoint to facilitate these conversations through my PhD. Both decolonizing methodologies and critical theories open up opportunities for imagining Indigenous archiving that is both culturally safe and in which priorities are determined by Indigenous peoples. In this context, my work is grounded in decolonizing methodologies and aligns with the groundbreaking theories of Maori academic Linda Tuihai Smith, who already in 2012 described decolonizing methodologies as a way to provoke some revolutionary thinking about the roles that knowledge production, and knowledge institutions play in decolonization and social transformation. I also tried applying critical theories to my work as they enable a critique of the current state of being, and they assist decolonizing processes. Lastly, my methodology draws from my positionality as a non-Aboriginal and outside researcher who has a transnational understanding of both the Italian and Australian space and transcultural skills to work with these archives. I always think that the ethics and morals which drive my work are very important, and I usually clarify them at the beginning of every conversation I have. And they are all embedded in Indigenous research paradigms and include relationality, reciprocity, and respect. And as you can see from the diagram here on the screen, relationships are at the center of my research design. Giving back in this context is an important moral of this research. And for this reason, I'm now working with 3 Italian collecting institutions to find, organize, and contextualize a sample of their Aboriginal archival collection. The main aim is to increase accessibility of these records through a participatory digital archive to try to reconnect them with the Aboriginal peoples and communities this information comes from. And this work includes a lot of steps, but also allows to translate and contextualize in Italian important protocols and concepts which might not be accessible over there, such as the Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. And I would like here to acknowledge, the many Italian researchers who are helping me in this journey. When I speak about participatory digital archive, I mean not only a platform where to access this record, but a space of negotiation between Italian institutions and communities for reply, curation, storytelling, and local translation of this information. The archive is built upon the content management system for Indigenous contents, Mokachu, developed by Washington State University, who probably some of you might already know. So to conclude, the long-term vision of this study is to contribute to the archival field in order to opening up opportunities for imagining Indigenous archiving that is culturally safe and community-driven, and in which future priorities are determined by the Aboriginal peoples which are represented in these archives. For me, it's also about working with Italian institutions to learn and promote an idea of Aboriginal culture which is current, strong, vibrant, in a space like the Italian one, where the most part of accounts are written about Aboriginal people and rarely by. Because there is still a lot to do to recognize the transnational relationship among European countries and colonial powers, which were all involved, directly or indirectly, in the subjugation and slavery of Aboriginal peoples and appropriation of Aboriginal land. They all have been benefited from it in some ways. And there's this slide. I hope that this study could also open up more conversations about the importance of records which are expressed in language other than English, and that could give completely different point of view from the British narrative, which has been a stopper from truth-telling and a treaty in Australia. So please do keep in touch if you are interested to chat more, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Monica. Oh, what have I done? There we go. I'm clicking on the wrong buttons. There we go. Thank you so much, Monica. Fantastic, introduction and information about your research, and really interesting to hear about just the records that are held in Italian collections about Aboriginal people, and the work to translate both the actual materials, but then also the sort of concepts behind it as well. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. If people want to, unmute themselves and ask a question live, they're more than welcome, or you can ask a question in the chat, however people want to. I don't know whether any of the panelists have questions for each other. But maybe just to give people a few minutes to think or type out their questions, I might start. Kirsten, you mentioned, or you spoke about obviously the importance of using yarning in interacting with the people you interviewed as a way. I'm wondering what the people you interviewed, how they felt about the yarning process. Did they also reflect on that process as part of those discussions you had with them? Or wonder just if you can talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. And I just wanted to thank Monica and Cheeto they were really, it was great to hear your presentations. And Cheeto, I was just thinking about the whole question of cultural safety, what I'm looking at in terms of your research. It really resonated. And I think, Kirsten, your question about research participants, it's been this, I think that's what I was trying to sort of demonstrate in the presentation, this reciprocal process has been that I've been going backwards and forwards to people and making sure that, you say one thing in an interview on one day, and you want that to keep connected with people, and you want people to make sure that their stories are represented in the best way that people feel comfortable around that. So I've really negotiated how people want their stories told, if they want them to be attributed or anonymized. So if people are really calling out major issues, they can be anonymized in the data. Interestingly, most people want attribution, which has been really fantastic. But I'm just in that sort of circle back at the moment as I write things up, and I've shared with Sue, who I know is on the call, and Shannon and Alex, that a lot of people are coming back with sort of affirmations about the research process, and the data that I'm giving back about their own stories has empowered them to take different kind of acts. So I feel like the methods they've really generated a beautiful energy, and it speaks to sort of the whole truth telling and justice piece, but it's also incredibly personal for people. So I'm really interested for me now in how we pull everyone's stories together. I think people haven't seen that, and when they see them all together, I think it'll be really revealing and powerful. Yeah,
thank you. I think definitely it'd be really exciting to see some of that come out if it can. No one has any questions. I'm just going to keep talking, but please feel free to jump in, everyone, if anyone wants to say anything. What do we have? Monica, I wonder if you can talk more about, I guess, the nature of, or some of the records that are in the Italian collection, sort of, what information they might hold, or, how did they get there, or how were they created in the first place?
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously a work in progress, and I don't think my work will go even near to locate all the archival records that they are. But the most part were written by Italian, in particular, explorers, obviously missionaries, but also migrant that went to Australia, and some of them. I mean, the interesting part when I was speaking before about trying to look at displaced archive in Italy as one example is that as more as you delve into them and as more you recognize that they are all linked to each other, because of course there were just few explorers at that time that were studying together. They were all supporting evolutionary theories, so they were in the same rich kind of circles. But they're also, obviously, when I mentioned the role of the Vatican, all the letters and all the maps and all the accounts that were sent from missionaries, Italian missionaries in Australia to the Pope, for example. So that's a large amount. But in my research, I'm finding, as I said, I'm every day challenged by the idea of what an archival record is. For example, there are some videos which were produced, which are online, for example, but they were produced by Italian filmmakers. And so for an Italian crowd, and so with subtitles in Italian and title in Italian, but they represent and they are taken in communities, Australian communities. So yeah, I'm sure we will find out more, but there is a wealth of kind of different materials.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. Rose, you have your video on, and do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yep. I just firstly want to say thank you to all three panelists. They were fascinating presentations, and Chido, I found it really interesting, the parallels of what you're discovering in your research as to what I'm discovering in mine in Australia. I think, you know, again, the colonial project is replicated all across the world. And Monica, I just wanted to ask if, how would Aboriginal communities, how are they finding out about these records that in Italy? Are you reaching out to them, or is there a way, is there a central place where they could inquire as to whether there's any records about them and their families?
Thank you, Rose. Yeah, so I'm working on a digital archive using the platform Mokachu to be able to, you know, to work with the institution to digitize what they have, what they want to include. Of course, we're speaking about huge collection in some cases, so that will be a small part of it, but through the digital archive to include them. And as you know, the Mokachu system allows for a range of cultural protocols to be applied. So of course, it's not, you know, up to me to decide which records should be open, which closed, but this gives me a little bit of space to try to contact the communities where they come from. And at the moment, of course, I don't have one framework to follow for this, because the big problem is that the most part of these collections are don't have any provenance. So what I'm trying to do, and that's part of the work with the, you know, Italian institutions, is to try to put together the information that I have, try to translate them where appropriate in English, so people could access the archive and hopefully add information and find more information. And in this process, the interesting part is that there are also some Australian researchers who are actually just participating with the information and the research that they have to be added. So it's kind of becoming this agglomerate of information from different languages and different research background, but they hopefully will provide some more information on where this record come from. And my process is about obviously trying to follow, I didn't say it in the presentation, but I follow the IATSI's Code of Ethic and other guidelines that will take me through the project and to try to understand who are the best person in the communities to link to.
Thanks. I'd be fascinated to know more through my QSA role. I'd be fascinated to know if there's many records that relate to Queensland mobs at some point. So I will touch base with you.
No worries, I will definitely be in touch, Rose. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Chido, a question for you. This model or this method of, you know, looking at colonial archives as settler colonial records seems to be, you know, from your example, a really, really rich methodology. So I wonder if you could just talk more about that and, is your intention to do that same sort of reading or same sort of analysis with other records in the archives, or yeah, what's the plans there?
So a big part of my doctoral research is kind of writing the history of the archives in Zimbabwe and kind of how they've been through these multiple identity changes as Rhodesia went through its many changes. But one of the things I was noticing as I started my research is that the stories are always told through the post-colonial lens, right? Like the context of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as a failed settler project doesn't come across. So settler studies don't take up Rhodesia in the way they would in Australia or Canada, but also Indigenous studies ignore African indigeneity. So I think what I'm trying to do is to add Zimbabwe, Southern Africa to those conversations in settler studies and Indigenous studies, to be like, what happens when we put this Blackness and Africanness within these conversations? What do we learn about settler colonialism that's different? What do we learn about how settler logics perpetuate, how they continue to endure within these archives, despite us saying that they're now post-colonial? Because I feel that's part of the reason why decolonization is stuttering in Zimbabwe, that we're not fully engaging with the settler nature of the archive.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And yeah, as Rose said as well, so that, yeah, I agree, so many parallels between, yeah, what you were reflecting on and the Australian, what's happened in Australia. I am conscious of time, so if no one's got a last question, I am just going to put in the chat both just the AIRI website and also the AIRI YouTube channel, where this and other recordings from the week will be. There are still lots of sessions happening throughout the rest of the week, so yeah, you can jump on the website and you can still sign up for those. I really want to thank our speakers here tonight. You're all doing such amazing and interesting work, but yeah, in such a considered and reflective way. It's a real pleasure to hear from all of you, and the work that you're doing is so important, and yeah, just really looking forward to see where you all where it all comes to for all of you. But yeah, so thank you so much for sharing your work and your reflections tonight, and thanks to everyone for listening and participating. And yeah, unless there's any final thoughts, we can go off into the night or the morning or the day or whatever it is where everyone is coming from. So thank you.